Christmas episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. How can you tell it's a Christmas episode of the show? Well, I'm surrounded by Christmas accoutrements. I've crammed as much in as I could possibly get in. And of course, obviously, the Goodrum Show folklore has to have it. Of course, the Christmas silver sparkly reindeer puts in its yearly appearance. So yes, indeed, it is the festive episode of the show. Now next weekend could well be working, but if I'm not, we may well get a second Christmas episode of the show, you know, cold leftovers or sloppy seconds as the case may be. But as far as this weekend is concerned, this is indeed the Christmas episode of the show, and as you well know, I always like to try and do something a little bit special for the Christmas episode of the show, and well, I think this is going to be a pretty special tasting. We're looking at the Imperial Distillery. Obviously, Imperial was closed or for good back in the late 90s, 1998, so I thought, well, yeah, why not? And this is probably the only time I'll ever get the opportunity to do an episode of the show on Imperial, because, well, you don't see it nowadays at all. I mean, back in the sort of 2000s, it was regularly a feature of certain independent bottling companies' lineups. I mean, certainly I remember the Duncan Taylor Battle Hill range would regularly have an 8-year-old. And, you know, a lot of people kind of like had a bit of a downer on Imperial. They saw it as a filler malt because, well, it was one of those distilleries that was purely used for the blends. But, you know what, I mean, all right, it wasn't the most complex of whiskies, certainly not in its formative ages, shall we say. But it matured really well. It developed this lovely, dense, honeyed kind of character, and I've got some quite mature samples here in front of me, and hopefully that will obviously back up my claim. And you know, I always liked a little bit of an underdog. I mean, really, when it comes down to it, I mean, Imperial was one of those distilleries, a bit like Cappadonic, that in actual fact throughout its entire life spent more time closed than it actually did in production. I mean, it's all a bit of a sad story really, but it kind of perfectly encapsulates, shall we say, the high points and the low points of the whisky industry over its lifetime, shall we say. Founded in 1897 by a chap called Thomas Mackenzie, built it basically right at the wrong time, just a few years before the Patterson crash of the sort of early 1900s. I mean, you can look that up. And literally within a few years, it mothballed it. And it kind of reopened again after the First World War for a short period of time. Until about 1925, when it was acquired by DCL, Distillers Company Limited, or the forerunner to Diageo. I mean, Diageo had kind of like, you know, back in the early 1900s, proclaimed itself to be the largest whisky company in Scotland. I mean, that wasn't strictly true. And, you know, they had to kind of, I suppose, back that claim up. So, you know, post World War One, they went on a humongous buying spree and bought up pretty much all the competition. And well, by the sort of I guess the 1930s, they were the largest and still are in actual fact. And the problem was that sort of. DCL didn't really know what the hell to do with the distillery. I mean, they bought it in 1927 and then just promptly mothballed it again. You know, it was like, you could argue that's kind of like, you know, the mindset of a company like DCL or Diageo as they now are, that it didn't really matter. It was an acquisition. They just wanted to be big. They wanted as many distilleries. It didn't really matter whether they were in production or whether they could actually do anything with them. I mean, that was the big point, you know, and it was just, we had to have them, you know, and so consequently it pretty much stayed closed for 30 odd years until the 60s, and then of course boom time for whiskey in the 1960s, and it was brought out of its mothball status. I believe they invested some money and it got it working again. And then we got to 1985 when we had yet another one of those crashes, and poor old Imperial once again gets closed. And this time it looked like it possibly could be the end, but it was then sold to Allied Distillers in the early 1990s, and they promptly sort of started up production again, and guess what, 6 years later it was mothballed yet again. Again, the problem was that Allied didn't really quite know what to do with the malt. I mean, they had blends such as Ballantyne's, Stewart and Teachers, which already kind of had set malt requirements, and yet they go and buy another distillery, and it's like, well, what the hell do we do with it? I mean, they probably did use it in some of those blends, but it really was kind of, I wouldn't quite say unloved, but it was kind of, you know, just pushed from pillar to post and never had a real kind of place anywhere. That was the problem. Yeah, it is a real, like I said, it is a real sort of sad puppy dog tale, it has to be said. You know, it was, I guess at the end of the day, always doomed and closed for good in 1998. And I mean, there were rumours that it was going to be brought back on stream yet again, but obviously the owners decided that well, by that time it was Pernod Ricard. They bought the distillery in about 2005, I think it was, and promptly decided it was probably going to be a lot easier just to demolish the entire place and build a brand spanking new state-of-the-art distillery, which they have named Dalmunnock. I mean, I think they used bits of brick and the odd doorway and what have you that used to be in the Imperial distillery, but Imperial is now long gone. And well, like I said, some people never really sort of mourned its passing, but you know what, I did. I mean, all right, it never had the cachet of some of the other closed distilleries like Brora and Port Ellen. But you could pick it up for, you know, relatively speaking, a song. And it was, to me, always a lovely whiskey. And hopefully today's tasting will reinforce that fact. And, well, if you ever find a bottle of Imperial, then I would suggest you pick it up, because it still won't be ridiculously expensive, I don't think.
So old worries on your mind, and still 5 years later.
Anyway, so that's a little bit of potted history about the distillery. Obviously, if you want to find out more, you can find that out online. So what we're looking at, what we're tasting today, like I said, these are all really old samples, and I was quite surprised that, considering how little of the juice was left in each of the bottles, they've actually survived, but they have indeed. And we're going to kick off with a Douglas Laing Old Malt Cask 16-year-old. Refill Bourbon Hoggy, DL7018, distilled in April of 1995 and bottled in April of 2011. Second bottling we're looking at again is a Hunter Laing Old Malt Cask bottling. Again, Refill Bourbon Hoggy, HL9815, distilled in May of 1995, bottled in May of 2013. Obviously both of those are at 50%. And obviously I mentioned Duncan Taylor earlier on in the piece, when I was saying that they used to bottle some lovely 8-year-old Imperial in their Battle Hill range. They also bottled some in their Rare Old range as well, which this is one. And this is a 19-year-old single bourbon cask 450, distilled in January of 1990, bottled in July of 2009. And I remember there was about 3 or 4 casks that were all bottled at roughly around about the same sort of time, and I certainly remember them being really good, and they were on the shelf at Shea Gauntley. Although obviously, as you well know, any comments I make during today's episode of the show have no relevance to the company and are purely my own thoughts and criticisms and, well, yeah, all that kind of stuff. Anyway, just thought I'd let you know that. Moving on, we're looking at a 22-year-old Mackillop's Choice single bourbon cask again. 11972, distilled in December of 1990, bottled in March of 2013 at 57.9%. Then we're going to move on to an AD Rattray, or Dewar Rattray as they were known at the time, individual cask bottling of Imperial, 25 years old, a refill sherry hoggy 1410, distilled in March of 1983, bottled in November of 2008 at 46.9%. And the final bottling, and well, if you ever see this on the shelf somewhere, grab it. Oops, I've just given away what I thought of it there. It's a Douglas Laing Old Malt Cask, 35-year-old. It was a refill sherry butt, DL7431, distilled in October of 1976, bottled in October of 2011, and hopefully that will see the show going out with a bit of a bang. While we're on the subject of independent bottlings, I have found out some more information with regards to the Independent Bottlers Challenge. Technically it hasn't been shelved, the categories have shifted to a certain extent. I mean, back in the day when the World Whisky Awards kind of started, it was pretty simple. It was distillery bottlings, because distilleries did ranges, independents bottled single casks. Now, of course, the boundaries are blurred somewhat, and pretty much every independent bottling company now has a range of some form. You've got things like Cask Isla, Smokehead, Black Bull, Mackillop, all that kind of stuff, and it's kind of like, well, where do they fit in the competition scheme of things, shall we say? Yes, technically they're independent bottlings, but they're kind of like a range. So the World Whisky Awards have now decided to allow those ranges to be judged within the World Whisky Awards, and I'm hoping that the Independent Bottlers Challenge will come back again next year purely as the sort of staple diet of the independents, the single cask bottling. So yeah, that's a little bit of an update on that. So right, I think I've waffled for enough, so let's make a start then. Right, okay, so let's kick off with the Old Malt Cask 16-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Wow, I mean that smells really mature. I mean, you would have thought that was well into its 20s, if not its 30s. I mean, that's gorgeous, dusty American oak, oodles of honey, sort of apricot, a little bit of lemon, white fruit. Creamy bourbon. I mean, alright, yes, like I said, it's not exactly what you would call mind-blowingly complex, but what it delivers is absolutely stunning. And that maturity, I mean, I have no idea what this went on the shelf at back in the day, but oh my god, that's good. See what it smells like. Dry, elevated citrus notes, again honey, white fruit, touch of spice, medium length. Oak is kind of just interfering a little bit with the finish. Again, like I said, not exactly the world's most complex of malts, but that's a lovely mouthful, it has to be said. Yeah, okay, like I said, it's sort of, it's all right. It's not sort of like, blowing me away with its complexity, but I'll tell you what, I mean, that nose was absolutely stunning. Alright, you could argue the palate is maybe not quite living up to that nose, but certainly nothing wrong with that at all. I think that was spot on. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Hunter Lang Old Malt Cask 18-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Less oak. Deeper, more honeyed. It's got a little nip there, citrus, almost kind of graininess, satsuma, tangerine, sugar. I mean, that is a lot more of a complex nose. I mean, partly it's because the oak isn't so noticeable, so it is allowing a bit more spirit character to sort of come forward. And you know what, I mean, that's a lovely spirit. I mean, you could build a gorgeous blend around that, certainly if you were putting together something with a bit of age. you know, it's just adding a little bit of dense honey, a little bit of citrus, and you can build around that, you know. And that is just fantastic. It just goes to show that the quality of the spirit that was coming off those stills at Imperial was pretty bloody good. Anyway, let's see what pals like. Oh, that's a beautiful palate. I mean, getting the sawdusty American oak coming through now. Some violets, a little bit more citrus. It's got some lovely citrus lift on the mid palate, sort of a little bit of lemon, white fruit. Again, gorgeously honeyed, long. Quite the opposite. The other one, where you know the palate is probably slightly more impressive than the nose, to be fair. But either way, I mean, that is a stunning whiskey, and
That's not a movie scene in your mind.
Right, okay, so let's move on to the rare old 19-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Now we're sort of in the kind of similar sort of nose area. Nose area? What the hell am I talking about? Similar kind of nose to the Hunter Lang, but it's more intense. It's got that sort of, again, honeyed barley, yeah, probably more barleyed character. A little bit of vanilla. It's got a real intensity, a real edginess to it. I mean, maybe it's that extra 3.9% alcohol, possibly. It's got a lovely natural character. There's a touch of coffee, earth. There's almost a salinity there as well. I mean, this is really complex. I mean, you know, I did say that sort of Imperial wasn't renowned for its complexity, but you know, this is actually pretty impressively complex, and certainly complex by, you know, Imperial standards. I mean, that's lovely. The intensity is there. Just yeah, that's good. That's a good whiskey. See what the pulse like. Again, it's got that natural barley, earthy intensity. The honey is noticeable. It's not as soft as saying that the previous bottlings. It's got that kind of, I wouldn't quite say rawness. The elevated alcohol is certainly sort of giving it a lovely spiciness to the finish. And it really, like I said, this is belying the fact that, you know, Imperial was a sort of like, you know, a homogeneous filler kind of malt. I mean, this has got some real intensity, real complexity, and liveliness as well. Like I said, the intensity is just absolutely stunning. Fantastic stuff. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Mackillop's Choice bottling. So 22 years old, bottled at 57.9%. Let's see what nose goes on this thing. Very similar to the Duncan Taylor bottling. Luscious, honeyed, but it's got that sort of vibrant minerality, that sort of earthiness, that edginess, slight grassiness, touch of perfume, white fruit. Again, subtle oak. It's not got that sort of overt oakiness. Lovely warmth to it, underlying sort of subtle spicy notes. I mean, again, absolutely stunning. See what pulse like. Very much like the Duncan Taylor bottling. Intense, slightly grassy, quite straw-like, barleyed. The honey is noticeable, but kind of kept in check, I guess, by the alcohol. Certainly that sweetness is being kept in check. I certainly obviously didn't have enough to sort of put a little drop of water with it, but certainly from from memory, that kind of opened it out and it became more luscious and juicy and citric. Again, lovely spiciness on the finish. That the alcohol is kind of just inching up those spices and inching up that intensity, you know. And I mean, you know, I mean that probably wasn't a cheap bottling at the time, but in the general, you know, scheme of things, it probably, you know, 22-year-old Port Eleanor brewer, you know, well, yeah, somebody will be fleecing you for that, but that, stunning. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Dewar Rattray 25-year-old. Will we ever see bottlings of this kind of age coming out of Dewar Rattray? I mean, I doubt very much whether they've got any stocks of Imperial left now. And I think like a lot of the indies are now kind of, you know, having to sort of release younger spirit because they just don't have the sort of, you know, the older casks left in their inventory. But anyway, let's see what the nose gives on this end. Again, very similar to the previous two, which just goes to show how consistent Imperial was. I mean, you know, brittle barley, mature honey, a little bit more maltiness, wood spices. Slightly sort of, it's got that kind of mature, dusty library kind of notes, more so than a sort of an overt sort of woody character. I mean, yes, obviously it's refill sherry, there's a little bit of dried fruit, but it's really well and truly sat in the background, and it just adds that soupçon of dried fruit, a little bit of old polish, slight leafiness. I mean, again, stunning, absolutely stunning. I mean, it's kind of, there is a sort of Glen Granty-ish kind of character happening. It's not quite so sort of upright as a kind of Glen Grant, and maybe it's not quite so minerally. Maybe it's sort of got nothing at all to do with bloody Glen Grant. What am I talking about? But it feels a bit like that, you know. It's got that kind of gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous, stunning. I mean, you know. I mean, will we ever see stuff like this ever again? Well, will I ever get samples of stuff of this kind of nature ever again? Probably unlikely, with so many of the independent bottling companies now choosing not to send out samples. I mean, I've really struggled this December, it has to be said. You know, so many are just saying, you know, technical difficulties, or they just basically outright say, no, we're not sending out any samples, we haven't got any, you know. And it's kind of, well, do you want anything in this? Well, no, I'm not buying stuff that I don't actually know what the hell it's like, you know. And it's really, really difficult at the moment to sort of get hold of independent bottlings. But anyway, that's by the by. This is just stunning. Let's see what the palate like. Oh, the length on that is just sublime. I mean, okay, not hugely complex. A little bit more sherry character, perhaps. A little bit more dried fruit, dusty spices, honey, a little violety note, touch of dried spice. Yeah, kind of dried spice. Drying spice on the finish, I should say. Yeah, okay, so the palate is not quite at what the nose is showing, but either way, the length on that was sublime. I mean, that's still going on. And like I said, it's just, again, testament to the quality of the spirit that was coming off those stills. Yeah, okay, this is probably, like I said, sort of, you know, more classically sort of Imperial, not quite so complex, but, you know, just such an enjoyable mouthful, it has to be said.
You want to tap the tension, why everybody knows in time as it always
Right, okay, so on to the final whisky of the afternoon. This is the Old Malt Cask 35-year-old. Of course, obviously, if Douglas Laing were releasing stuff like this would not be in the the sort of the basic range. It would be in the more fancier range, in a box and all that kind of stuff. But back in not that long ago, in actual fact, 10 years, these sort of things were quite regularly turning up in their basic kind of range. Anyway, that's enough of that. Let's see what those are like. Oh, that's a majestic nose. I mean, really, more Glen Granty, it has to be said. Again, refill sherry, but cedar, wood notes. It's quite upright, quite sort of, it's quite spicy, sort of, soft, delicate, almost kind of incense-like spices. Honey, touch of vanilla coming through, a little bit of sawdust, black pepper, white fruit, little floral note just starting to sort of creep in. There's a sort of like the sherry notes kind of like just drop off a little bit. A sublime, stunning, I mean, absolutely awesome. I mean, this is a sort of whiskey that you just want to keep putting your nose back into and going, that's something else I can pick up. And I guess, I mean, all right, like I said, the spirit maybe is not incredibly complex, but by the time you've left it for 30 odd years in a cask and you've got the secondary and the tertiary characteristics coming through, it really does make for a complex whiskey. And there's a touch of citrus as well. It's still so vibrant and alive, and it's just stunning. I mean, if this was on the market, I hate to think how much this would cost now. This would be sort of lavish packaging, all that kind of stuff. I mean, I'm never going to see the likes of this ever again, and so I'm going to just wallow in this majesty of a malt. Right, palate. Again, lovely natural feel to it, earthy, spicy, less honey, a little bit more sherry character, a little bit more dried fruit, touch of heather. Oh, the finish is stunning. I mean, it's got that kind of slightly sort of cognac-y kind of note happening, a little bit of baked fruit right on the aftertaste, lovely spices. Again, the honey is kind of maybe slightly darkened by the sherry character, slightly oily. I mean, absolutely sublime. I mean, that is stunning. I mean, it really is a gorgeous whiskey, and like I said, I think it was just an absolute, well, yeah, like I said, Imperial just had one of those histories. You could almost see from the day it was first built, it was doomed it was. And it was a shame, a real shame, because the spirit, as I think today's sort of tasting has demonstrated, was absolutely fantastic quality. I'm just sad it's gone. I really am. But there you go. That's the sort of like that's the whiskey industry for you. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. But like I said, I mean, it's a real shame. Imperial's gone, but it's gone. That's life, at the end of the day. And when you're sort of tasting, these kind of things, you're just sort of like, wallowing in a little bit of history and something that will never ever be repeated. And a big thank you to the independent bottling companies that have kindly sent the samples. I mean, admittedly they were donkeys years ago, but it's without their support, obviously there would be no good Dram show. Well, I think that would be a bit of a shame, don't you? Anyway, so the old malt cask, the two old malt cask bottlings, that we'll do them side to side. I mean, they were great bottlings. I mean, maybe sort of palate nose difference. I think they kind of just showed the sort of like, you know, what Imperial was all about. I mean, it would have been nicer if I had maybe a sort of like a young Imperial to sort of like balance it up against, but you know, unfortunately, I didn't have any of those samples left, so I'm kind of working with what I am working with. And yeah, they were probably slightly more oak centric. I mean, it wasn't really until we got to the sort of like the Duncan Taylor rare old bottling where we start to see the sort of like the real natural character come through without too much kind of oak input. And it really showed that, in actual fact, that although it had a lovely honeyed kind of soft character, there was a sort of like, you know, a bit of a natural kind of earthy sort of barley sort of character happening there. And it sort of followed in really into the sort of the Mackillop's Choice bottling, which was very similar in actual fact. And like I said, it just kind of showed how consistent the spirit was that came off the stills at Imperial. And then the two refill sherry bottlings. Obviously, you know, the AD Rattray bottling, absolutely stunning. You know, all right, maybe not quite so complex on the palate. Bloody great nose, and the finish was just absolutely sublime, it has to be said. And the Old Malt Cask 35-year-old. I mean, it's just, it's a privilege, it's a pleasure to sort of taste whiskies of that kind of age, and I know that, you know, the chances of doing an episode of the show like this, say in another, what, 5 or 10 years, will be probably pretty difficult, because you just won't get the samples, or I won't get the samples. So so yeah, I mean, stunning. I mean, you know, a Christmas cracker of a show. I know. Yeah, and like I said, you know, if you do ever spot a bottle of Imperial, apart from that bloody god-awful one, well, it wasn't god-awful, in the Allied distillers, before they sort of like, you know, mothballed the distillery and sort of knocked it down, they released the one and only distillery release, which I think they called the last bottling or something like that, and it really was quite crap. You know, when you've got this kind of like, you know, level of history and sort of complexity, and they released this 15-year-old, which was kind of, all right, it wasn't bad, but it really wasn't sort of anything to sort of write home about, you know, and you would have thought they could have picked something a damn sight better to sort of like, you know, celebrate the distillery with, but they didn't. They produced, you know, something quite disappointing really. But anyway, like I say, if you ever get the opportunity to get hold of a bottle of Imperial, doesn't matter what age statement or anything like that, just buy it, you know, because it still, I guess, won't be that expensive in relative terms, but really, yeah. Anyway, so I'd like to thank every one of you guys for watching the shows over the course of the year. I really hope you've enjoyed them. I really appreciate your comments, feedback, all that kind of stuff, even when you're critical. And no, honestly, I do appreciate all of your feedback, and hopefully, you know, you'll stick around for the next year, because obviously, as you well know, next year is indeed the 10th anniversary of the show. I mean, where does 10 years go? I mean, it's certainly sort of giving me more wrinkles and so on and so forth. But anyway, yeah, so that's it. I hope you have a wonderful Christmas. I hope somebody buys you some lovely whiskey rather than something a bit. And obviously, if you are visiting my employer, you know, just yeah, you will walk away with a damn good bottle. Doesn't matter what it is, what the price point is. You will walk away with a bloody good bottle of whiskey. I can guarantee that. But anyway, until then, have a lovely Christmas, and all that's left to say is, oh, no more whiskey left. Good dramming and good afternoon.